200 years before a queen tried to take Westeros back with 3 dragons of her own, another Targaryen already knew it could be done, because he had done it first. He had no navy to match the Iron Islands, no army to match the Reach, no cavalry to match the Vale. What he had was smaller, stranger, and far more dangerous. 3 riders, 3 dragons, and a plan. In 2 years, 7 kingdoms became one. A throne was forged from 1,000 swords. A war camp became the greatest city in Westeros. And a continent that had never been conquered, not by the First Men, not by the Andals, knelt to a foreign house that had arrived on Dragonback with fewer than 1,500 soldiers. This is the story of how that happened. Not a legend, not a show. The history, as the Maesters actually recorded it, uncertainty included. Before we go further, a word on where this story actually comes from, because it matters, and because a serious documentary owes its audience that honesty up front, rather than as a footnote.
Nearly everything known about the Conquest today descends from accounts compiled generations after the fact by Maesters of the Citadel, most systematically in the work later published as Fire and Blood, itself an attempt to reconcile multiple, sometimes contradictory earlier chronicles, court records, and oral tradition into a single continuous history. The Maesters compiling these accounts were not eyewitnesses. They were scholars, working, in many cases, a century or more after Aegon's death, weighing conflicting testimony, discounting obvious exaggeration where they could identify it, and, by their own admission, preserved in the text itself, sometimes simply unable to determine which of 2 or 3 competing versions of an event was true. This is why this documentary keeps stopping to weigh what the histories confirm against what they only suggest, rather than narrating the entire Conquest as a single, seamless, certain story. The Maesters themselves did not have that certainty, and pretending otherwise, smoothing over every gap and contradiction into one clean narrative, would actually be less faithful to the real history than sitting with the uncertainty where it exists. Troop numbers in this story are almost always somewhat inflated or vague, because medieval-style musters were rarely counted precisely, and chroniclers writing generations later had every incentive, deliberate or not, to round upward for effect. Direct quotations attributed to figures like Miria Martell or Harrenhal should be understood as the flavor of what was likely said, preserved and probably polished by oral tradition, rather than a court stenographer's transcript. None of this means the broad shape of the Conquest is in doubt. The order of the campaigns, the outcomes of the major confrontations, the fates of the great houses, these are corroborated across multiple independent strands of the tradition, and are about as solid as medieval-style history gets in this world. What remains genuinely uncertain is mostly in the texture, exact numbers, precise motivations, the fine details of individual conversations. This documentary will keep flagging that line as we go, rather than pretending it isn't there. With that said, let's continue the story, as the Maesters themselves eventually agreed to tell it. In the 2 centuries before Aegon's landing, Westeros was divided among a shifting number of independent, self-styled kingdoms. The label Seven Kingdoms is itself a later simplification. At various points, there were more than 7 crowned rulers south of the Wall, and the borders between them had been fought over, redrawn, and fought over again for 1,000 years. Before we can understand the Conquest, we have to understand what Aegon was actually looking at from Dragonstone. Not 1 country, but 7, sometimes 8 or 9, armed, proud, and mutually suspicious kingdoms, none of which had ever needed to cooperate against anyone, because no one had ever been able to threaten all of them at once. Let's walk the map. The Kingdom of the North was, by land area, the largest in Westeros, bigger than the other 6 kingdoms combined. Ruled from Winterfell by House Stark, it was thinly populated relative to its size. Its strength measured less in numbers than in endurance. Long winters, long memories, and a warrior culture forged by centuries of war against the free folk beyond the wall, and in earlier ages against the first men who preceded them and the Andals who never fully conquered them. By the time of Aegon's conquest, the king in the north was Torrhen Stark. Fire and Blood suggests the North could field one of the largest hosts in Westeros when fully mustered, tens of thousands of men, though exact figures are, as with most medieval-style musters in this history, approximate at best. The North's real strategic asset wasn't its army size, it was distance. Any invader had to survive the Neck, the swampy causeway separating the North from the Riverlands, a choke point the Starks and their bannermen, House Reed among them, had used for centuries to bleed larger armies dry before they ever reached Winterfell. The Vale of Arryn was, in a sense, Westeros's most naturally defended kingdom. The Eyrie itself, seat of House Arryn, was carved into the giant's lance and reachable only by a single narrow mountain road, a fortress that had, in the entirety of recorded history, never fallen to siege. The Vale's knights were famed for their heavy cavalry, and its geography meant any invading force had to fight through the Bloody Gate, a choke point as formidable in its own way as the Neck. At the time of the conquest, the Vale was ruled by the young Shara Arryn, acting as regent, as accounts of the exact regency arrangement vary, but it is agreed the Vale's throne was occupied by a woman, navigating the kingdom's politics without a strong adult king at its head. This mattered enormously for how the conquest played out there, as we'll see. This is where the map gets genuinely strange, and where Aegon found his first real opportunity. By tradition and older rite, the Riverlands belonged to no one permanently. For centuries, they had been fought over by the Iron Islands, the Vale, the Rock, and the Reach, changing hands more often than any other region in Westeros. At the time of the conquest, they were held by House Hoare of the Iron Islands, under King Harrenhal, called Harren the Black, who ruled both the Iron Islands and the Riverlands as a single conquered domain from a castle he had spent 40 years and countless Riverlander lives building. Harrenhal, the largest castle ever raised in Westeros. Harren's rule over the Riverlands was a rule of conquest, not consent. The Riverlords, Tullys, Blackwoods, Brackens, and others hated him. This resentment would matter enormously once Aegon arrived. The Kingdom of the Rock, ruled by House Lannister from Casterly Rock, was the wealthiest of the seven. Its gold mines were, by reputation, the richest in the known world. Loren Lannister held the crown at the time of the conquest. The Westerland's military strength lay in its knights and its capacity to hire and equip large forces with its mineral wealth, though it lacked the Reach's sheer manpower or the Vale's defensive geography. The Reach was, in almost every practical sense, the single most powerful kingdom in Westeros by population and army size. Ruled by House Gardener from Highgarden, the self-titled Kings of the Reach also claimed overlordship of Oldtown, seat of the Citadel and the Faith, and commanded the largest single host any Westerosi kingdom could field. King Mern the Ninth Gardener sat the throne when Aegon landed. The Reach's army, combined with the Westerlands forces under Loren Lannister, represented the single greatest concentration of conventional military power gathered against Aegon during the entire conquest, and it would meet him at a place that would become synonymous with Dragonfire, the Field of Fire. The Stormlands were ruled by House Durrandon from Storm's End, a castle whose walls were said never to have fallen to any siege or storm in its long history. King Argilac Durrandon, called Argilac the Arrogant, held the crown at the time of the conquest, an old king by then, his kingdom's strength diminished from wars with Dorne that had bled the Stormlands for a generation. And then there was Dorne, Geographically, culturally, and politically distinct from the rest of Westeros in almost every way. Settled by Rhoynar refugees who intermarried with the first men already there, Dorne alone among the future Seven Kingdoms had never been fully conquered by the Andals, and its laws, its inheritance customs, and its style of warfare all reflected that independence. Ruled from Sunspear by House Martell, with Princess Marya Martell, called Marya Whipsnake, on the throne at the time of the Conquest. We will return to Dorne at length, because Dorne is the exception that proves every rule this documentary is about to lay out. What all of this tells us is that Seven Kingdoms was never a description of stability. It was a label of convenience for 7 armed camps that had spent centuries fighting each other over the very borders Aegon was about to erase. The Reach and the Rock had old grievances. The Iron Islands' hold on the Riverlands was resented by the River Lords themselves. The Stormlands and Dorne had been at war for a generation. The North kept to itself. The Vale, secure behind its mountains, rarely involved itself in the affairs of the rest of the continent at all. It's worth naming a few of these old grievances specifically, because they will each resurface, directly or indirectly, in how individual kingdoms responded when Aegon actually arrived. The Reach and the Rock had a long history of contesting the fertile borderlands between Highgarden's domain and Casterly Rocks, a rivalry old enough that, ironically, it was precisely this history of cooperation through necessity against each other that made Mern Ninth Gardener and Loren Lannister's alliance against Aegon both notable and, in the end, insufficient. The Riverlands had been fought over by the Iron Islands, the Vale, the Reach, and independent riverlords for so long that no single claim to the region commanded universal legitimacy even among the riverlords themselves, which is precisely why Harrenhal's rule there, resting on conquest rather than consent, would prove so brittle the moment a stronger conqueror arrived. And the generational war between the Stormlands and Dorne had left House Durrandon's kingdom measurably weaker than it might otherwise have been, a fact Argilac Durrandon's own overconfidence seems not to have fully accounted for when Aegon's ships appeared on the horizon. It is also worth noting what these 7 kingdoms did not have, since its absence explains as much as any single rivalry. There was no Council of Kings, no standing alliance structure, no tradition of mutual defense against a common continental threat, because prior to Aegon, no such threat had ever existed. Westerosi warfare, for 1,000 years, had been kingdom against kingdom, or crown against rebellious vassal within a single kingdom. The entire concept of 7 kingdoms uniting against a single invader was, in the most literal sense, untested. There was no precedent anyone could look back on, no institutional memory of how such a coalition might even be assembled, let alone led. Aegon did not merely arrive with an overwhelming weapon. He arrived at a moment when the political structure most likely to stop him, coordinated continent-wide resistance, did not exist even in theory. No unified Westerosi army had ever existed, because no one had ever needed one. That fact alone explains more about how quickly the Conquest succeeded than any dragon ever could. Though the dragons, as we'll see, are still most of the story. House Targaryen was one of many dragonlord families of the Valyrian Freehold, a civilization built on dragonback dominance over most of Essos. Roughly a century before the doom of Valyria, a Targaryen woman, remembered as Daenys the Dreamer, foresaw the Freehold's destruction in a vision. Her father, Aenar Targaryen, believed her, sold the family's holdings in Valyria, and relocated the entire house, along with its dragons, to Dragonstone, a volcanic island off the coast of Westeros that had once been a Valyrian outpost. This single decision is why House Targaryen existed at all by the time of Aegon,
every other Dragonlord family of Valyria was destroyed in the Doom. It's worth pausing on just how singular this decision made House Targaryen among the Dragonlords of Valyria, since it's easy to treat the Targaryens survived the Doom as a simple fact, rather than the genuinely improbable outcome it was. At the height of the Freehold, there were, by most estimates in the histories, dozens of Dragonlord families ruling different holdings across Valyria's empire, each with its own dragons, its own wealth, its own claim to the Freehold's power. Nearly every one of them remained in Valyria itself, at the heart of the civilization that had made them powerful, right up until the Doom consumed it all in a single catastrophic day. House Targaryen alone had relocated an entire generation earlier to a comparatively minor volcanic outpost on the edge of a continent most Valyrians would have considered a backwater. That decision, made on the strength of one woman's dream and one father's willingness to believe her, is the single most important event in this entire documentary that did not involve Aegon at all. Because without it, there is no Aegon, no Balerion, no Conquest, and no Iron Throne. There is only Valyria, and then, a century later, nothing. The Doom of Valyria came roughly a century after the Targaryens' departure, a cataclysm that in a single day destroyed the Freehold entirely, along with essentially every other dragon in the known world. The exact cause of the Doom remains unexplained, even in universe, though theories about the Valyrians' own magical practices interacting with the 14 Flames are widespread. This documentary isn't the place to resolve that mystery. What matters for our purposes is the result. House Targaryen, isolated on Dragonstone, became effectively the last dragon-riding house left alive. For roughly a century after the Doom, the Targaryens ruled Dragonstone and the small holdings around it, a minor lordship on the edge of a continent they did not control, watching Westeros' 7 kingdoms rise, fall, and fight among themselves. The family's dragon population dwindled somewhat in this period, as dragons are known to fare poorly in captivity over generations without expansion. Yet Dragonstone retained several, including 3 that would become the most famous dragons in Westerosi history. It's worth imagining, briefly, what this century must have looked like from the inside. A family that had once been dragon lords of an empire spanning much of a continent, reduced to ruling a single volcanic island and a scattering of nearby holdings, watching the 7 kingdoms of Westeros fight their endless wars from a comfortable, irrelevant distance. Nothing in the historical record suggests the Targaryens of this intervening century harbored active plans of conquest. If anything, the picture is of a family consolidating what little it had left, its dragons a dwindling and increasingly ceremonial asset rather than an active instrument of policy. Whatever changed to turn Dragonstone from a quiet backwater into the launching point of a continental conquest happened within a single generation, Aegon's own, and the sources are far more confident about what happened next than about exactly why it happened now rather than 50 years earlier or 50 years later. By the time Aegon the First Targaryen came of age, House Targaryen was still, functionally, dragon lords without an empire, the last remnant of a civilization that had ruled through fire, sitting on a rock within sight of a continent that had no idea what was coming. Aegon was the younger of 2 sons of Lord Aegon Targaryen, and inherited Dragonstone after the deaths of his father and elder brother. He married both of his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, in the Valyrian custom the Targaryens had preserved, a practice that would remain a defining and controversial feature of the dynasty for generations. By most accounts, Aegon was not a flamboyant man. The surviving picture of Aegon, assembled from Fire and Blood's synthesis of conflicting maester accounts, is of a quiet, calculating, unusually patient ruler, more comfortable planning than boasting, more interested in the machinery of conquest than in its glory. He is not recorded as impulsive. Nearly every major decision attributed to him in the Conquest, where to land, whom to fight, whom to spare, reads as the product of deliberate calculation rather than martial passion. It's worth dwelling on what this temperament actually meant in practice, because it shaped every campaign that followed. A more theatrical conqueror, and Westeros had certainly produced its share of those, might have led with a single overwhelming demonstration and dared the rest of the continent to resist. Aegon instead behaved throughout the war like a man solving a series of connected problems. Which kingdom's ruling house could be co-opted rather than destroyed? Which single act of destruction would do the most persuading with the least further bloodshed? Which defeated lord could be trusted with continued authority, and which could not? Even his silences are recorded as calculated. Several accounts describe him receiving news of both victories and losses with the same outward composure, offering little of the triumphant rhetoric later legend would put in his mouth. This matters because it complicates the simple conqueror label the character invites. A purely glory-seeking warlord does not, as a rule, spend his first weeks on foreign soil building a fort instead of marching to battle, and does not, as a rule, offer his most dangerous enemies a path to keeping their titles. Whatever else drove Aegon, the evidence points to a mind oriented toward outcomes, a durable, governable, unified Westeros, rather than toward personal glory in the moment of victory. His dragon was Balerion, called the Black Dread, already ancient by the time of the Conquest, and so far as the histories record, the largest dragon living in Westeros at that time. His sword was Blackfire, a Valyrian steel blade passed down through the family, which would later give its name to the most dangerous rebel dynasty in Targaryen history, the Blackfire Pretenders, born generations later of a different Aegon's bastard son. There is a grim irony worth noting here, though it lies outside this documentary's proper scope. The sword that helped forge the dynasty's founding victory would, a century later, lend its name to the rebellion that came closest to tearing that same dynasty apart. Aegon's relationship with his sisters is one of the most consequential political facts of the entire Conquest. The three operated less as a king and two consorts than as something closer to a ruling triumvirate, Aegon setting overall strategy, but Visenya and Rhaenys each commanding independent campaigns, making independent political decisions, and in Rhaenys' case, ultimately dying in service of the family's ambitions in a theater of war Aegon himself never personally led. This is not how conquest ordinarily worked in Westeros, where military command sat with a single king or a single appointed marshal. Aegon appears to have trusted his sisters with genuinely independent authority over entire fronts of the war, the Vale to Visenya, Dorne eventually to Rhaenys, a division of command that only made sense because each of the three could, individually, bring a dragon's worth of unanswerable force to bear wherever they were sent. One thread worth pulling on, since it recurs throughout the whole conquest, is how Aegon justified what he was doing. Not to us, 6 centuries later, but to the lords he expected to eventually govern. He does not appear to have claimed the Iron Throne on the basis of any existing Westerosi right of inheritance. The Targaryens had no blood claim to any of the 7 kingdoms before the invasion. Instead, the claim Aegon built was retroactive. Conquest first, then a throne literally forged from the proof of that conquest, then a governing structure that made continued Targaryen rule the path of least resistance for every great house left standing. It's a claim built on demonstrated capability rather than inherited right, which is precisely why the surviving house's willingness to be incorporated, rather than simply crushed, mattered so much to whether the new dynasty could actually last past Aegon's own lifetime. Visenya was the elder of Aegon's 2 sister wives, a warrior in her own right, trained with sword and known to wear armor and fight personally, an image that stands in some contrast to the more courtly roles typically occupied by queens in this history. Her dragon was Vhagar, and her blade was Dark Sister, another ancestral Valyrian steel sword of House Targaryen.
Visenya is consistently portrayed across the surviving accounts as the most ruthless and politically hard-edged of the three. Where Rhaenys is remembered for charisma and Aegon for calculation, Visenya is remembered for decisiveness bordering on severity, the sister most willing to use fear as a tool of statecraft, and the one most associated in later years with the darker political maneuvers of the early reign, including suspicions, never confirmed, of her involvement in the death of Aegon's son Maegor's political rivals. Her relationship with Rhaenys is described in the histories as one of mutual respect rather than warmth. Two very different women bound by marriage to the same man and by shared purpose, but not, so far as any account suggests, close confidants. It is worth dwelling on what Visenya's command of the Vale campaign actually tells us about her independently, apart from her later reputation. Sending Visenya, rather than Aegon himself, to negotiate the Vale submission suggests a writer trusted not merely to intimidate, but to close a genuinely delicate political negotiation, one involving a young ruling regent and a kingdom whose geography meant it could plausibly have held out behind the Bloody Gate indefinitely if handled badly. That the Vale entered the realm without a major battle under Visenya's personal oversight argues for a political shrewdness the Iron Fist reputation doesn't fully capture on its own. Visenya was not merely the sister who burned things. She was also, when the situation called for it, the sister who talked a kingdom out of a war it might otherwise have fought. Later Targaryen history would remember Visenya more for suspicion than for statecraft, the rumors, never confirmed, connecting her to the death of her own great-nephew Aegon, son of Rhaenys, and thus a rival claimant to her own son Maegor's inheritance, colored her reputation for centuries afterward. Whether any of that suspicion is fair is a question for a different documentary about the reigns of Aenys and Maegor. What can be said here, confined strictly to the conquest itself, is that Visenya's independent command performed exactly the function Aegon needed, a second front, run competently and largely without him, that brought an entire heavily fortified kingdom into the realm without a battle resembling the Field of Fire. Rhaenys was Aegon's younger sister-wife, remembered as vivacious, curious, and a patron of music and poetry, the Targaryen most associated with charm rather than force. Her dragon was Meraxes, and she is recorded as having traveled more widely and more visibly than either Aegon or Visenya in the years immediately following the conquest, taking an active hand in diplomacy, most notably, and fatally, in Dorne.
Where Visenya represented the iron fist of the new dynasty, Rhaenys is remembered as its more public, more personable face, a queen who reportedly enjoyed the company of common singers as much as high lords, and who took a personal interest in exploring the new kingdom she had helped conquer. This same curiosity and boldness would eventually take her to Dorne, and to her death. It is tempting, with the benefit of hindsight, to read Rhaenys' eventual death in Dorne as a kind of tragic foreshadowing, baked into her character from the start, the curious, adventurous queen undone by the one kingdom that refused to be charmed or cowed. That reading is emotionally satisfying, and this documentary won't pretend otherwise, but it's worth being precise about what the sources actually support. Rhaenys' willingness to personally lead the Dornish campaign appears to have been a continuation of the same active, hands-on role she had played throughout the conquest, not a reckless departure from it. She had by that point already flown Meraxes across much of the newly conquered realm, taken a direct hand in diplomacy in more than one kingdom, and behaved throughout as a ruler who preferred to see a situation herself rather than govern it from Dragonstone. Dorne was, in that sense, simply the next campaign. It happened to be the one campaign where the usual rules stopped applying. Rhaenys' public visibility also served a distinct political function the more severe Visenya could not have replicated. She gave the new dynasty a human, approachable face at a moment when Aegon's forces had just finished demonstrating at Harrenhal and the Field of Fire exactly how much destruction they were capable of. A conquest sustained entirely by fear tends to be brittle. Rhaenys' patronage of singers and poets, her visible interest in the realm's people rather than only its lords, gave the new order something closer to genuine goodwill to stand alongside the Terror, an asset that mattered enormously in the years immediately after the fighting stopped, when Aegon needed the great houses to believe the new dynasty intended to govern them, not merely hold them at sword point indefinitely. What emerges from the sources is a genuinely unusual command structure for a medieval-style conquest. Not one general with subordinates, but 3 co-equal dragonriders, each capable of independent, continent-altering military action, coordinating, not always perfectly, toward a single goal. This is arguably the single most important structural fact about the Conquest's military effectiveness. A single dragon and rider can be everywhere important, one at a time. 3 dragons, ridden independently by 3 people who trusted each other's judgment, could be in 3 places at once, and Aegon used exactly that capability throughout the war, sending Visenya to the Vale, Rhaenys to Dorne, while he personally led the main campaign through the Riverlands, the Reach, and the North. All 3 dragons of the Conquest were already fully grown, powerful animals by the time of the invasion, none of them young, all of them proven. This matters. Unlike later Targaryen conflicts fought partly with juvenile or newly hatched dragons, the Conquest was carried out entirely with 3 of the most mature, most capable dragons the family had ever possessed. Balerion was, by every surviving account, the largest and most fearsome of the 3. Black-scaled with red eyes, old even by dragon standards. Old enough, in fact, that later legend, speculation, and almost certainly exaggeration claimed he might have been alive during the doom of Valyria itself, though the more sober histories place his hatching sometime after the Targaryens' arrival on Dragonstone. He would go on to outlive Aegon by decades, eventually being ridden by Aegon's son Maegor, and dying only in the reign of Aegon's grandson. Balerion's fire is described across multiple accounts as uniquely destructive, his flame credited with fully consuming Harrenhal's massive towers in a single night, an act no ordinary siege engine of the era could accomplish in months, let alone hours. Vhagar was, at the time of the Conquest, the youngest of the 3 dragons, but already formidable, and would go on, in the century that followed, to become, by most accounts, the largest dragon alive after Balerion's death, eventually ridden in later Targaryen history by warriors including Prince Baelon and generations later, Aemond Targaryen, during the Dance of the Dragons. During the Conquest itself, however, Vhagar's role was defined by Visenya's own campaigns, most notably in securing the Vale. Meraxus was, by several accounts, smaller than both Balerion and Vhagar, but still an immense and lethal weapon of war, ridden by Rhaenys throughout her independent campaigns, including her final one in Dorne, where Meraxus met an end unlike any other dragon of the Conquest, brought down not by another dragon, nor by any conventional army, but according to the most widely credited account, by a single scorpion bolt to the eye, fired from Dornish fortification. We will return to this in detail, because Meraxus's death is one of the most important events of the entire war, proof that even the mightiest dragon was not invulnerable. It's worth pausing on a dimension of the Conquest the cinematic retellings tend to skip past entirely. What it actually took, logistically, to keep 3 adult dragons operational across 2 years of continuous campaigning, hundreds of miles from their home roost. This isn't a minor footnote. It shapes why the Conquest moved the way it did, why certain campaigns were led by certain riders, and why even a weapon as devastating as dragonfire had practical limits the histories only mention in passing. Dragons of Balerian's and Vhagar's size required enormous quantities of food to sustain the energy expended in sustained flight and repeated use of flame. Cattle, sheep, and whatever game could be provided, in quantities that scaled directly with the dragon's size and activity. A campaign of the length and geographic spread the Conquest required, from the Crown Lands to Harrenhal to the Field of Fire to the north to Dorne and back, would have demanded either an extensive supply logistics operation trailing the army specifically to keep the dragons fed, or reliance on local livestock requisitioned or seized as the army advanced. The histories don't dwell on this in detail, which is itself a small gap worth noting. We know a great deal about where the dragons struck, and comparatively little about the mundane, unglamorous work of keeping them fed and rested between those strikes. This also helps explain the division of labor among the three riders. A single dragon and rider covering the entire continent alone without rest would have faced real limits. Dragons, for all their power, still needed to feed, still needed periods of rest between major exertions, and still, so far as the sources suggest, retained enough of an animal's practical needs that treating them as inexhaustible weapons available at every hour would be a misreading of how they actually operated. Splitting the campaign three ways, Aegon through the Riverlands, Reach, and North, Visenya to the Vale, Rhaenys eventually to Dorne, wasn't only a matter of political trust. It also meant no single dragon needed to be everywhere at once. Each could rest and feed on its own schedule between engagements, and the overall tempo of the war could be sustained far longer than a single dragon campaign could have managed. It's tempting for any documentary on this subject to produce precise wingspan and length comparisons between Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes, the kind of infographic detail that makes for compelling visuals. This documentary is going to resist that temptation, because the honest answer is that the books themselves do not provide reliable, consistent measurements for any of the three, and numbers that circulate widely in fan discussion of this era are, without exception, extrapolation or invention rather than confirmed canon. What can be said with confidence, ranked only in relative terms, Balerion was the largest of the three, and remained so for the rest of his long life. Vhagar started the war smaller than Balerion, but would eventually grow to rival him in the century after Aegon's death. Meraxes was the smallest of the three throughout the Conquest itself, a fact that may have made her marginally more vulnerable to the kind of concentrated anti-dragon weapon that eventually killed her in Dorne, though the sources do not draw that connection explicitly, and this documentary flags it here only as reasonable inference, not confirmed fact. The comparison is worth making plainly. A Westerosi army of the era, even a large one, tens of thousands strong, moved at the pace of its slowest wagon, was vulnerable to disease, desertion, and supply failure, and took days or weeks to redeploy across meaningful distances. A dragon could cross the length of a kingdom in hours, strike an army in its camp before it had even formed ranks, and do so with a weapon, fire raining from the sky, that no medieval-style force had any real defense against, short of extraordinary luck or purpose-built anti-dragon weapons, like the scorpion that eventually killed Meraxes. This is the single most important strategic fact of the entire Conquest, and it will recur throughout this documentary. Dragons did not merely add firepower to Aegon's small army. They removed the entire premise on which Westerosi warfare had operated for thousands of years, that bigger armies won. 3 dragon riders effectively rendered army size close to irrelevant, at least until Dorne discovered a way to make the equation matter again. This is a question the books deliberately do not answer with certainty, and any honest documentary has to say so plainly.
Aegon began assembling his invasion force following a series of dreams, reportedly shared by Rhaenys, interpreted as prophetic warnings. Fire and Blood records this explicitly, while also noting that the maesters who compiled the history were skeptical of prophecy as an explanation and searched for more grounded political motives. Several explanations coexist in the sources, and none of them cancels out the others. Political fragmentation. Westeros, in the years before the Conquest, was unusually vulnerable. The Storm Kings and Dorne locked in exhausting war, the Riverlands under resented foreign occupation by the Ironborn, no unified command structure anywhere on the continent. A calculating ruler like Aegon could reasonably have recognized a strategic window. Dragonstone's exposure. Some maesters argued Aegon invaded partly out of concern that Dragonstone, an isolated holding within reach of larger Westerosi kingdoms, could eventually be threatened itself, and that Conquest was, in effect, a preemptive consolidation of power rather than naked ambition. Prophecy and the Song of Ice and Fire. It was speculated that Aegon and Rhaenys believed in a coming apocalyptic threat from beyond the Wall, and that unifying Westeros under a single crown was intended, at least partly, as preparation for that far future war. This idea gained enormous retrospective weight after later events in the series, but Fire and Blood itself treats it as one interpretation among several, not an established fact, and the maesters of the era are recorded as doubting it. Ambition, plainly. It would be dishonest to leave out the simplest explanation. Aegon commanded 3 dragons, an ancient and unmatched military asset, and a small kingdom that could never grow much larger on its own. Conquest was, in the most basic sense, the logical use of overwhelming force by someone who had it. The honest answer this documentary can give is probably some combination of all of the above, in proportions no surviving account can precisely establish. Aegon left no memoir. What we have are actions, and the actions tell their own story. Aegon crossed Blackwater Bay with his sister wives, a modest invasion force. Estimates in the sources suggest a force numbering in the low thousands, a strikingly small army for a continental conquest, and landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, at a site that would become King's Landing. The location was not accidental. The site offered a defensible high point, Aegon's High Hill, command of a major river artery reaching deep into the Riverlands, and proximity to Dragonstone across the bay, allowing supply and reinforcement without a long overland march. Within days of landing, Aegon's forces began constructing a wooden fort atop the hill, the structure that would be remembered as Aegon Fort, the seed from which King's Landing would eventually grow. This is worth pausing on, because it's easy to rush past. Aegon did not begin his conquest with a grand battle. He began it by building. The first act of the war was construction, not destruction. A statement, whether deliberate or not, that this was not a raid. Aegon intended to stay. It's worth pausing longer on the geography, because it explains far more of the conquest's subsequent shape than is usually credited. The mouth of the Blackwater Rush sat at almost the exact center of the future Seven Kingdoms, within striking range, by dragon, of the Riverlands to the northwest, the Stormlands to the south, the Reach beyond that, and the Crownlands themselves, all within a single day's flight. No other landing site on the eastern seaboard offered the same reach in every direction at once. Whether Aegon selected the site with this in mind, or arrived at its strategic value only after the fact, the sources cannot say with certainty, but the pattern of the campaigns that followed, radiating outward from that single hill in almost every direction over the following 2 years, argues strongly for deliberate planning rather than accident. There is also a quieter piece of statecraft embedded in the choice to build rather than raid first. An invading force that lands, burns a coastal town, and withdraws to ships is behaving like every other seaborne raider Westeros had faced for 1,000 years, the Ironborn most notoriously. An invading force that lands and immediately begins raising a permanent structure is declaring something categorically different. This is not a raid to be weathered and forgotten, but the first building of a government. Word of Aegon Fort's construction would have reached the nearest Westerosi lords within days, well before any dragon had burned anything at all, and it would have told them, correctly, that whatever this was, it wasn't going away on its own. Word of the Targaryen landing reached King Argiloch Durrandon at Storm's End within days, carried by the same coastal watch and beacon system every Stormlands lord maintained against exactly this kind of seaborne threat. A system built, ironically, mostly with the Ironborn in mind, never tested against an enemy like this one. It's worth remembering the condition the Stormlands were actually in this moment, because it shapes everything that follows. Argilax's kingdom had spent a generation locked in intermittent war with Dorne, a conflict that had bled the Stormlands of exactly the kind of deep manpower reserves a sudden second front demanded. Argilax himself was, by this point, an old king, proud, by every account, to the point of the epithet history remembers him by, but commanding a kingdom that was not at the height of its strength when the single most dangerous threat in its history arrived on its coastline. Before the main confrontation, the histories describe smaller actions, outriders and coastal levies sent to probe the Targaryen beachhead, testing the size and composition of the force that had landed. Actions that would have given Argilax his first, incomplete reports of what he was actually facing. These initial skirmishes achieved little beyond confirming that a real invasion, not a raiding party, had arrived. Aegon's forces held their ground around the growing fort at Aegon's High Hill, and no early engagement here proved decisive in either direction. What these skirmishes could not have adequately conveyed, because no messenger who saw it firsthand had yet survived to report it in full, was what would happen once the Targaryen dragons were committed to a real battle, rather than held in reserve over a fortified camp. Argilax responded by sending his household knight, Orys Baratheon, reputed to be Aegon's own natural or half-brother by some accounts, though this parentage is speculation rather than confirmed fact, ahead with a force to meet the invaders directly, while the king himself gathered the Stormlands' main host to follow. This decision to divide the response, sending an advance force under Orys while the main army mustered behind it, would prove to matter enormously for how the following battle actually unfolded. The confrontation, remembered as the Battle of the Last Storm, ended in catastrophic defeat for Argilax. The Stormlands forces, already weakened by years of war against Dorne, were unable to withstand the combined pressure of Targaryen dragonfire and disciplined ground forces. Argilax himself was killed in the fighting. Accounts vary on exactly how, some crediting single combat with Orys Baratheon, others crediting the general chaos of a battle fought under dragons. It's worth reconstructing the tactical shape of this battle a little further, since it establishes the template for nearly every subsequent land engagement of the Conquest. A conventional Westerosi army of this era fought and won through disciplined formation, knights massed for a charge, infantry holding a line, the whole apparatus depending on units staying where their commanders placed them. Dragonfire, introduced into that equation, did not need to defeat the Stormlands army in a fair fight of arms. It needed only to break that discipline, to turn an organized battle line into a panicked scatter that Orys Baratheon's own ground forces could then exploit. This is, in miniature, exactly what would happen at vastly greater scale at the Field of Fire in the chapters ahead. Dragons breaking cohesion, conventional forces finishing what the fire started.
The aftermath produced one of the Conquest's most important political innovations, one Aegon would repeat again and again. Rather than exterminate the defeated ruling house or install an outside administrator, Aegon elevated the victorious commander into the vacant lordship. Orys Baratheon married Argilac's daughter, Argella Durrandon. Accounts of the circumstances of this marriage vary, and some traditions describe Argella's initial capture and resistance before the political marriage was arranged, details that remain matters of interpretation rather than settled fact, and was granted the Stormlands as Lord Baratheon, founding a new great house on the ashes of the old one. This is worth naming plainly as a pattern, because it recurs throughout the entire Conquest. Aegon did not simply replace conquered kingdoms with Targaryen governors. He created new aristocratic dynasties, loyal to him personally, seated atop the same lands and the same local populations, inheriting the old kingdom structure while owing their entire legitimacy to the new crown. House Baratheon was the first, but far from the last example of this strategy.
It's worth sitting with how fast this all happened. From the moment Aegon's ships crossed Blackwater Bay to the fall of Argilac Durrandon at the last storm, the sources describe a campaign measured in weeks, not months or years, a pace that would have been essentially unthinkable for any conventional Westerosi army attempting to subdue an entire kingdom's ruling house by force. The Stormlands were not a weak kingdom. Storm's End's walls were, by long reputation, unbroken by siege or storm alike. What fell at the last storm was not the castle. Storm's End itself never had to be taken, but the field army defending it. And with that army went any realistic prospect of continued Durrandon resistance. This is the first data point in a pattern the rest of this documentary will keep returning to. Castles, however formidable, were built to survive sieges. Almost none of them, anywhere in Westeros, had ever needed to survive an enemy that could simply annihilate the army meant to relieve or garrison them before the siege had properly begun. Storm's End would go on to earn its reputation for holding against literal storms, and later sieges in the centuries after the Conquest. But in the Conquest itself, it never had the chance to prove that reputation, because the war around it was already over.
Harrenhal, king of the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, had spent nearly 4 decades and the forced labor of thousands of Riverlanders constructing Harrenhal, the largest castle ever built in Westeros, with towers so massive that, by later report, their sheer scale worked against them structurally. It's worth briefly establishing how House Hoare came to rule the Riverlands at all, since the arrangement was itself born of an earlier conquest, not ancient right. The Hoares had extended Ironborn dominion from the Iron Islands onto the mainland Riverlands within living memory of the conquest itself, seizing a region that had never had a single stable ruling house of its own for long, and imposing a foreign, sea-born aristocracy on a landlocked population with its own distinct traditions, faith, and loyalty to its own older, smaller riverlord houses, the Tullys, Blackwoods, and Brackens chief among them. Harren inherited this conquered domain from his forebears, and rather than easing its administration, chose to entrench it further, conscripting the very population he ruled into building him the most massive fortress Westeros had ever seen. Harren's rule over the Riverlands was rule by conquest, and remained deeply resented by the riverlords he governed, the Tullys, the Blackwoods, the Brackens, and others, who had never accepted Ironborn overlordship as legitimate. This resentment would prove decisive. Harren's confidence, by most accounts, rested almost entirely on Harrenhal's scale. He seems to have believed no army could take a castle of that size, and there's no strong evidence he seriously prepared for the possibility that his enemy might not need an army to bring it down at all. Harren refused to submit to Aegon's demands, and remained in Harrenhal as Aegon's forces approached, apparently trusting the castle itself to see him through any siege. It's worth understanding exactly what Harren believed he was protected by, because the scale of the miscalculation is central to why Harrenhal became the story it did. Harrenhal's outer walls alone were reported to be taller than the walls of most Westerosi cities. Its 5 great towers, the King's Spire, the Kin's Tower, the Widow's Tower, the Wailing Tower, and the Tower of Ghosts, were each individually comparable in height to a great keep elsewhere in Westeros. Building it had taken the labor of thousands of Riverlander conscripts across roughly 4 decades, worked to death by some accounts, a human cost that itself hardened the Riverlords' hatred of Harren long before Aegon ever arrived. In purely conventional military terms, Harren's confidence wasn't unreasonable. No besieging force in Westerosi history had ever assembled the resources to starve out or storm a castle of that size, and none was likely to for generations to come. Harren had built, in effect, a fortress designed to be permanently unconquerable by every method of warfare Westeros had ever developed. It is worth imagining, as the histories invite us to, what news of Aegon's landing and the fall of the Stormlands would have meant to Harren as it reached him. He had spent essentially his entire adult life and the last of his family's fortunes on a single strategic bet. That scale alone, embodied in stone, was the ultimate answer to any threat the mainland could produce. Reports of a foreign house arriving with dragons rather than armies would have offered him no obvious way to update that bet. Harrenhal had not been built to withstand fire from the sky, because nothing in 1,000 years of Westerosi warfare had suggested such a threat was possible. Whether Harren genuinely disbelieved the reports, or believed them but saw no alternative to trusting in the only defense he had, the histories do not resolve, but either reading arrives at the same outcome. He had built it 4 decades too early to know what was coming. But Aegon had not yet faced the greatest fortress in Westeros. Aegon arrived at Harrenhal, and when Harren refused to yield, Balerion took to the air. What followed is among the most famous single events in all of Targaryen history. Balerion's fire is recorded as having engulfed Harrenhal's massive towers, the stone itself reportedly softening and slumping in the heat, an image so vivid it has survived across multiple retellings, even where other details of the conquest are contested. Let's walk through the night itself, as the histories describe it. Aegon's forces arrived and made camp within sight of Harrenhal's walls, and by most accounts, a final demand for surrender was sent to Harren before any attack began, consistent with the pattern Aegon would repeat at nearly every subsequent confrontation of the war. Force offered a choice before it was used. Harren refused. Whether out of genuine confidence in his walls, stubborn pride, or simple disbelief that any single weapon could threaten a structure of that scale, the histories do not fully resolve, suggesting some mixture of all three. What happened next took, by most accounts, a single night. Balerion took to the air over the castle and unleashed fire directly onto its towers and battlements. The scale of Balerion's flame, even accounting for centuries of embellishment in the retelling, appears to have genuinely exceeded anything the castle's builders had planned for. Harrenhal's very size, ironically, may have worked against it, its massive towers acting as chimneys that drew and concentrated the fire rather than simply shedding it. Stone reportedly softened and ran in the heat in more than one account, an image so vivid that it has survived essentially unchanged across every retelling of the conquest since, even where other details are contested. Harren the Black died in the flames along with most of his household, and with him died House Hoare's rule over both the Iron Islands and the Riverlands in a single night.
The destruction was severe enough that portions of Harrenhal have remained visibly warped and ruined ever since. Melted, half-collapsed towers standing as a permanent physical scar on the landscape, unlike any other castle in Westeros, and a standing monument to what dragonfire could do that no siege engine ever could. Even centuries later, in the era covered by A Song of Ice and Fire itself, Harrenhal's ruined towers and its reputation for being cursed or ill-fated remain directly traceable to this single night. The military and psychological lesson of Harrenhal cannot be overstated, and it rippled across every subsequent kingdom Aegon approached. Stone walls, however massive, existed to defeat armies, to force attackers into slow sieges that could be starved out or relieved, a form of warfare every Westerosi lord understood in his bones. Dragons made the entire premise of castle defense obsolete overnight, and they made it obsolete in the single most visually unmistakable way possible, by destroying the one castle in Westeros every lord already knew by reputation to be unconquerable. Word of Harrenhal's fall traveled ahead of Aegon's army for the rest of the war, carried by Riverlander survivors, by traders, by the same Maester network that would eventually write the histories we're drawing on now. And it is difficult to separate how much of the Conquest's remaining speed came from further military victories versus simple, reasonable terror at what had just happened to the largest castle in the world. There is also a political dimension to Harrenhal's fall that deserves equal weight alongside the military one. The River Lords Harren had ruled by conquest. The Tullys, Blackwoods, Brackens, and others who had labored under his 40-year building project and resented every year of his rule did not, so far as the sources indicate, mourn Harren's death or rally to avenge him. If anything, the destruction of House Hoare appears to have been met locally with something closer to relief. Aegon had, in a single night, not merely destroyed a rival king, he had removed an occupying power the local nobility had never accepted as legitimate in the first place, and in doing so, he had made his own arrival look, to at least one part of Westeros, less like conquest and more like liberation. That distinction, however self-serving it may have been for Targaryen propaganda in the years that followed, was not entirely manufactured. The Riverland's subsequent, largely peaceful absorption into the new realm owes as much to this political fact as to any fear of dragonfire. King Mern IX, Gardener of the Reach, recognizing the scale of the threat after Harrenhal's fall, allied with Loren Lannister, King of the Rock, combining the Reach's enormous manpower with the Westerland's knights into the single largest conventional army assembled against Aegon during the entire war. This was, by every account, the correct strategic instinct. If any Westerosi force could match Aegon through sheer numbers, it would be this one. It's worth understanding why this alliance, on paper, looked like the strongest possible answer to the Targaryen threat. The Reach alone could field a host larger than most other Westerosi kingdoms combined. Its population and agricultural wealth supported armies of a scale the North or the Vale could never match. Add the Westerland's knights, equipped and provisioned by the richest gold mines in the known world, and Mern IX and Loren Lannister had assembled something no Westerosi alliance had managed before. A single force large enough, in theory, to simply absorb whatever losses Dragonfire inflicted and still win through sheer weight of numbers. It was, in other words, exactly the strategy that had always worked before against every other threat the Seven Kingdoms had ever faced. Rebellions, invasions, rival claimants. Numbers had always eventually won. They had never before had to survive being on the receiving end of 3 dragons acting together in the open with nowhere to disperse. For the first time,
a Westerosi army would discover what it meant to fight dragons at scale. The combined Reach Westerland's host met Aegon's forces at a location remembered ever after as the Field of Fire. Exact troop numbers are, as with most figures from this era, uncertain and likely exaggerated in the retelling. But this was the single largest pitched battle of the Conquest, and the Gardner-Lannister army substantially outnumbered Aegon's ground forces. It did not matter. Let's reconstruct the battlefield itself as the histories describe it. The Field of Fire was open, largely flat grassland. Good ground, by every conventional standard, for exactly the kind of battle Mern IX and Loren Lannister intended to fight. Heavy cavalry charges, disciplined infantry lines, room to maneuver a large host and bring its full numbers to bear. It was, in short, ideal terrain for a medieval army, and catastrophic terrain for an army that needed to avoid presenting a single, densely packed target from above. Whether the Reach Westerland's commanders had any real alternative, given that an army of that size needed open ground simply to muster, march, and supply itself, is a fair question the histories don't fully resolve, but the tactical result is not in doubt.
Aegon deployed all 3 dragons, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes, together against a densely packed conventional army with nowhere to retreat and no answer to fire raining from above. Accounts describe the attack coming in successive passes rather than a single strike, the dragons wheeling back again and again over a host that had no means of dispersing quickly enough to escape the fire, its own density and discipline, the very qualities that made it formidable against any conventional enemy, becoming a fatal liability against this one. Cavalry formations that would have devastated an ordinary infantry line instead became, from a dragon's vantage above, simply larger and more efficient targets. Standards and banners meant to rally men in the chaos of a normal battle instead marked, for the riders above, exactly where the largest concentrations of soldiers could still be found. The result was less a battle than a massacre. The bulk of the Reach Westerland's host was killed or routed in a single engagement, King Mern IX Gardner among the dead, ending House Gardner's centuries-long rule of the Reach outright. The ruling dynasty of an entire kingdom effectively extinguished in one afternoon. The scale of the casualties, even setting aside likely exaggeration in later retellings, appears to have been genuinely without precedent in Westerosi military history. Not a battle lost, in the ordinary sense of an army withdrawing to fight again, but the near total destruction of the single largest field army the continent had ever assembled. The Field of Fire is arguably the single clearest demonstration in the entire Conquest of why massed conventional armies were the wrong answer to dragons. Concentrating overwhelming numbers in one place, which had been the correct strategy against every other threat in Westerosi history, was exactly the wrong strategy against 3 dragons acting in concert. It simply provided a single densely packed target for fire from above. Every kingdom that surrendered after the Field of Fire without a major pitched battle of its own had, in effect, learned this lesson secondhand, at the cost of a single afternoon slaughter that every subsequent Westerosi lord could not help but factor into his own calculations. It is worth stating plainly what this meant strategically going forward. After the Field of Fire, no Westerosi kingdom outside Dorne would again attempt to meet Aegon's combined forces with a comparable massed field army. Torrhen Stark, gathering his own enormous host on the banks of the Trident, would have received detailed reports of exactly what had happened here before making his own decision, and the shadow this battle cast over every subsequent kingdom's calculations may be, in the final accounting, as decisive to the speed of the conquest as any single further engagement that followed it. Unlike Mern Gardner, Loren Lannister survived the Field of Fire and subsequently submitted to Aegon rather than continuing to fight. This decision,
Surrender after a devastating loss rather than continued resistance preserved House Lannister as a ruling dynasty in the Westerlands, still holding Casterly Rock under Targaryen overlordship, in stark contrast to House Gardener's total extinction. This is the first clear illustration of a pattern that will recur throughout the rest of this documentary. Submission, however humiliating, tended to preserve a house's power, while continued defiance after a decisive defeat tended to end it.
It's worth considering what Loren actually had to weigh in the immediate aftermath of the battle, since his choice would set the template every other surviving lord in Westeros could look to for the remainder of the war. He had just watched an allied king and an entire allied army destroyed beside his own forces in the single largest single-day military catastrophe in living Westerosi memory. He retained, even after the battle, the Westerland's wealth, its knights who had survived, and Casterly Rock itself, untouched, its legendary defenses never tested, because the war that mattered had already been decided in the open field before it ever reached the Rock's gates. Loren's calculation, whatever the precise reasoning behind it, arrived at the same basic conclusion Torrhen Stark would later reach at the Trident, and the Vale would reach under Visenya's pressure, that a house's survival mattered more than a crown's pride, and that Aegon's pattern of behavior so far, destruction for defiance, continuity for submission, was consistent enough to be trusted as an actual offer, not a trap. The North had an army large enough to challenge Aegon, but Torrhen Stark had a different weapon: judgment. Torrhen Stark marched south from Winterfell with what the sources describe as one of the largest single hosts gathered during the entire conquest, potentially rivaling or exceeding the army destroyed at the Field of Fire. He made camp on the northern bank of the Trident, apparently weighing whether to give battle, while Aegon's forces approached from the south. Let's spend real time on this moment, because it is arguably the single most consequential individual decision of the entire conquest, made not on a battlefield, but in a war camp, over what the sources indicate was a period of days rather than hours. Torrhen had marched south with the North's assembled strength, its great houses gathered under his banner, the Boltons of the Dreadfort, the Manderleys of White Harbor, the Umbers from the Last Hearth, the Karstarks, the Mormonts, and others, a coalition the North rarely assembled in full except in the gravest of circumstances. The scale of this muster tells us something important on its own. This was not a token force sent south as a gesture. Torrhen had committed the North's actual military strength to the field, which means the decision he ultimately made was not born of an inability to fight. He had, by every account, an army capable of giving battle. What he lacked was any evidence that giving battle would accomplish anything beyond destroying that army, in the same way the Reach Westerlands host had been destroyed at the Field of Fire. We can reconstruct, in broad strokes, what this council of war likely weighed, based on what the histories tell us Torrhen would have known by this point in the war. He would have had, by messenger and by the same word of mouth that had outpaced Aegon's army through every prior kingdom, detailed and by then well-corroborated reports of Harrenhal, the single largest castle in Westeros, reduced to slag and ruin in one night. He would have had reports of the Field of Fire, an army larger than his own, fighting on ground of its own choosing, effectively annihilated in a single engagement, its king among the dead. He would have known that Loren Lannister, who fought at the Field of Fire and survived, chose submission over continued resistance afterward and kept his seat at Casterly Rock for it. And he would have known that 3 dragons, not one, remained available to Aegon at every stage of the war, meaning whatever had happened at the Field of Fire could, in principle, happen again, at the Trident, to the North's own gathered strength. The northern lords gathered with Torrhen were, by most accounts, divided. Some historical retellings,
none of them treated as confirmed by Fire and Blood's own admission of uncertainty here, describe voices among the bannermen urging battle regardless, on the belief that the North's endurance and its knowledge of northern terrain might yet find an advantage no southern kingdom had managed. Other voices, by the same uncertain accounts, urged exactly the caution that Torrhen ultimately chose. What the histories agree on, with more confidence, is the outcome. After days weighing the decision, Torrhen chose to send terms rather than give battle. What happened next is recorded with unusual restraint by the histories. Torrhen, after days of consideration, and after, by most accounts, being made fully aware of what had happened at Harrenhal and the Field of Fire, chose to kneel rather than fight, submitting to Aegon without a battle being fought at all. He is remembered ever after in Northern memory as the king who knelt. The histories record the moment itself sparingly. Torrhen came before Aegon, bent the knee, and swore the North's loyalty to the new crown, exchanging his crown as king in the North for the title of Lord Paramount and Warden of the North under Targaryen rule, a title House Stark would hold for the next 3 centuries.
The debate this documentary was asked to explore, was Torrhen a coward or did he save thousands of lives, is not one the books resolve, and it shouldn't be resolved artificially here either. What can be said with confidence, Torrhen had already received detailed, credible reports of what Dragonfire had done to a massive stone castle and to an even larger conventional army than his own. A reasonable commander in his position had strong grounds to believe that battle meant annihilation, not merely defeat. Northern tradition itself has never fully forgiven the decision. The epithet, the king who knelt, carries a weight of quiet northern disappointment across the centuries that followed, distinct from outright condemnation, but never quite pride either, which tells you something about how contested it remained even within the North. But the alternative, judging by every other pitched battle of the Conquest, was almost certainly a slaughter rather than a victory. And unlike Myrnine Gardner, Torrhen would have known that going in, not discovered it too late.
Torrhen's submission preserved House Stark's rule of the North completely intact, the only kingdom in the entire Conquest where the ruling house kept both its throne and its full territory without a single battle being fought. Whatever judgment history has passed on the king who knelt, the North he ruled remained, structurally exactly the North it had been the day before, a distinction few other kingdoms in this story could claim. The Val submission came through a different mechanism than the North's. This was Visenya's theater, not Aegon's. Shara Aren, ruling the Val during a regency, ultimately came to terms with the Targaryens, and the Val entered the new realm largely without the kind of set-piece battle seen at the Field of Fire.
It's worth reconstructing why the Vale, of all the Seven Kingdoms, might have seemed the single hardest nut to crack by conventional means, and precisely why that reputation turned out not to matter. For 1,000 years, the Vale's defense had rested on a simple, brutally effective geographic fact. An invading army had to funnel through the Bloody Gate, a narrow mountain pass easily held by a small defending force against an army many times its size, and even an army that somehow forced the gate then faced the long, exposed climb up to the Eyrie itself, a fortress that had never fallen to siege in the entirety of recorded Westerosi history. Every previous war fought against the Vale, and there had been several across the centuries, had foundered on exactly this geography. Visenya did not need the Bloody Gate. Vhagar flew over it. Some accounts describe direct negotiation involving Visenya personally, leveraging both Vhagar's presence and the political reality that continued resistance after Harrenhal and the Field of Fire offered little realistic prospect of success. The Regency itself likely shaped how this negotiation unfolded.
Shara Aaron, governing the Vale without a strong adult king to rally the Vale's famed knights behind a single unifying martial figure, faced a decision under circumstances that gave her less room to gamble on defiance than a more established ruler might have felt he had. A regency navigating an existential threat to the kingdom's independence is, almost by definition, operating with less certainty and less unified backing than a king secure on his throne. And that uncertainty likely made the case for a negotiated peace, rather than a battle the Vale's own geography could no longer guarantee it would win, considerably easier for Visenya to make.
What the sources agree on, regardless of the precise texture of the negotiation itself, is the outcome. The Vale entered the new realm through agreement rather than conquest, one of only a small handful of kingdoms, alongside the North, to avoid a defining battle of its own during the entire war. The Erie's legendary, unconquerable geography, so effective against armies for centuries, offered little protection against a threat that could simply fly over the Bloody Gate entirely. And this fact alone marks one of the clearest illustrations in the whole Conquest of dragons rendering an entire category of previously unbeatable defense obsolete in a single stroke. A fortress built to be unreachable by land was not, it turned out, unreachable at all. It had simply never needed to consider the possibility of an enemy arriving from the sky. With Harrenhal dead and House Hoare extinguished, the Iron Islands required a new ruling structure, independent of the Riverlands, which reverted to their own local river lords under Targaryen overlordship, rather than remaining a single unified conquest kingdom. A direct reversal of decades of Ironborn rule that the river lords themselves apparently welcomed, having never accepted Harren's authority as legitimate in the first place. It's worth pausing on the Iron Islands specifically, because the political problem Aegon faced there was distinct from anywhere else in the Conquest. The Ironborn had their own deeply held traditions of choosing rulers. The Kingsmoot, a gathering of captains and lords to acclaim a new king by voice rather than strict hereditary succession. And Harren's line was not the only claim to authority the islands recognized. With House Hoare extinguished at Harrenhal, the Iron Islands were left to resolve their own succession, largely through this native tradition, under a new Targaryen overlordship that, by most accounts, intervened comparatively lightly in exactly how the Ironborn chose to organize themselves internally, so long as the island's new leadership acknowledged the Iron Throne's authority. This restraint, allowing a conquered people to keep their own method of choosing their own rulers, rather than imposing an outside claimant, mirrors the same broader pattern of governance through continuity seen everywhere else in the Conquest, adapted here to a political culture that didn't work quite like any other kingdoms.
In the Reach, with House Gardner extinct after the Field of Fire, Aegon needed a new ruling house to administer Highgarden and the enormous, wealthy region around it. Aegon elevated House Tyrell, stewards to the Gardner kings, to the lordship of Highgarden and the Reach, another example of the same pattern seen with House Baratheon, a loyal subordinate house elevated to replace an extinguished dynasty, inheriting the old kingdom's wealth and structure while owing its entire legitimacy to Targaryen conquest. It's worth noting how deliberately this choice reads in hindsight. A steward family, whatever its practical experience administering Highgarden's vast estates day to day, had no independent claim to the Reach whatsoever before the Conquest. Every scrap of its new authority derived entirely from Aegon's decision to elevate it. This made House Tyrell, from its very first day as a great house, perhaps the single most structurally loyal of all the new dynasties the Conquest created. Unlike Stark, Arryn, or Lannister, who could at least in principle look back on centuries of independent rule before Aegon, Tyrell legitimacy began and ended with the new crown's favor. It is difficult to imagine a more effective way to ensure a newly conquered kingdom's wealthiest house owed its position entirely to Targaryen goodwill. Aegon could burn Dorne, but he could not make Dorne surrender.
Dorne, alone among the future Seven Kingdoms, never submitted during Aegon's conquest,
and would in fact remain formally independent of the Iron Throne for nearly 2 centuries afterward. Under Princess Miriam Martell, Dorne rejected Aegon's demands outright. Dorne's advantages were structural, not merely military. Its desert geography offered no dense population centers or castles comparable to Harrenhal for a dragon to spectacularly destroy in front of a fleeing enemy army. There was, in a real sense, no equivalent field of fire for Dorne to lose. Dornish warfare, shaped by generations of conflict with the Stormlands, favored raiding, ambush, and withdrawal into the desert and mountains over massed pitched battle, precisely the kind of warfare least vulnerable to a small number of dragons, because there was rarely a single large target to burn. It's worth spending a moment on Miriam Martell herself, since her decision shaped everything that followed. The histories record her rejecting Aegon's demands directly and unambiguously, by one famous account, receiving his envoys while seated, and answering that Dorne bent its knee to no one. Whatever the precise details of that exchange, the substance of the response is clear and consistent across the sources. Dorne did not intend to negotiate the way the Vale or even the North ultimately had. This wasn't recklessness. Miriam and the Dornish lords beneath her had spent a generation fighting the Stormlands and understood, better than perhaps any other ruling house in Westeros, exactly what their own geography could and couldn't support in a prolonged war. They had every reason to believe that a war of attrition, fought on Dornish terms rather than Aegon's, was winnable, or at least survivable, in a way that no other kingdom's terrain allowed. The Targaryen campaigns in Dorne were not a single battle, but a sequence of expeditions, several of them personally led by Rhaenys on Meraxes, targeting Dornish strongholds, including Hellholt, Vythe, and other fortified holdings across the Desert Kingdom. Some of these expeditions produced tactical successes, strongholds burned or garrisons scattered, without translating into anything resembling the total collapse of resistance seen elsewhere in the Conquest. Dornish forces, rather than mustering to meet these expeditions in the open, consistently withdrew into the mountains and the deep desert, harassing supply lines and isolated detachments, rather than offering a target worth a dragon's fire. This is worth naming as a genuinely sophisticated strategic adaptation, not merely stubbornness. Every other Westerosi kingdom's military tradition assumed that a kingdom's fate would ultimately be decided by its main field army and its great castles. Concentrate strength, meet the enemy, and either win or lose decisively. Dornish tradition, shaped by the Rhoynar heritage of House Martell and generations of asymmetric warfare against a larger, better-supplied Stormlands, had never operated on that assumption in the first place. Dorne fought wars of exhaustion, not decision, and a war of exhaustion is, almost by definition, extremely difficult for even the most devastating single weapon to shortcut, because there is no single moment, no single field, no single castle whose fall ends it. Rhaenys led a campaign into Dorne on Meraxes. During an assault on the fortress of Hellholt, according to the most widely credited account, Meraxes was struck in the eye by a bolt from a scorpion, a large siege crossbow specifically built to bring down dragons, and crashed, killing both dragon and rider. This is one of the most significant single events of the entire Conquest, and this documentary has to be honest about what is and isn't confirmed. The Scorpion Bolt account is the version generally accepted in the histories, but Fire and Blood itself notes that details of the exact circumstances, whether it was a single lucky shot or a coordinated ambush, exactly which Dornish force was responsible, carry some uncertainty, as is typical of accounts compiled generations after the fact from partial and sometimes self-serving sources. Categorize this fairly as strong evidence rather than absolute certainty on the finer details, while the core fact, Rhaenys and Meraxes died in Dorne, brought down by Dornish defenses rather than by another dragon, is confirmed. The consequences rippled outward immediately. Aegon is recorded as having reacted with fury, escalating the war in Dorne considerably in the aftermath. But escalation did not translate into victory. Dorne's resistance did not collapse. If anything, Rhaenys' death became a symbol of Dornish defiance, succeeding where every other kingdom had failed.
In the aftermath of Rhaenys' death, both Aegon and Visenya are recorded as having personally led retaliatory campaigns into Dorne, burning towns and strongholds in a punitive escalation far more severe than anything attempted before Meraxes fell. This escalation reads, in the sources, as driven at least as much by grief and fury as by any coherent strategic calculation. And it is telling that even this heightened, personally led response, deploying 2 of the 3 most powerful dragons in Westeros together, still failed to produce a Dornish surrender. If overwhelming force alone could have won the war, this was the moment it should have. It didn't, and the reasons why matter. The First Dornish War dragged on inconclusively for years, marked by Dornish guerrilla tactics, assassinations of Targaryen-aligned figures, scorched earth retaliation by Targaryen forces, and no decisive battle of the kind that had ended every other kingdom's resistance elsewhere in the Conquest. It's worth being specific about what guerrilla tactics meant in practice, since the term can flatten a genuinely varied campaign of resistance into a single vague image. Dornish forces are described as ambushing supply columns moving through mountain passes where dragons could offer little useful support against a fast-moving raiding party that scattered the moment it was spotted. Poisoning wells and destroying stores of food and water in territory Targaryen forces needed to pass through, turning Dorne's own harsh climate into a weapon, and conducting targeted killings of lords and officials who cooperated with the occupation, making collaboration with the Targaryen cause a genuinely dangerous proposition for any Dornish lord who might otherwise have been tempted to submit the way Loren Lannister or Torrhen Stark had. None of this required winning a single battle. It required only making occupation more costly in blood and treasure than it was worth, a calculation that, over years rather than a single afternoon, began to work in Dorne's favor. This is the clearest possible demonstration of Dragonfire's actual military limits. Dragons excelled at destroying concentrated, visible targets, armies in the field, castles under siege, ruling houses gathered in one place to be intimidated into surrender. They were far less effective against a population that refused to concentrate itself into destroyable targets at all, that melted into the desert rather than standing to fight, and that had, in the Scorpion, demonstrated a working answer, however costly and lucky its first application, to the one weapon no other kingdom had been able to counter. Eventually, direct Targaryen military campaigns in Dorne were abandoned as unsustainable, and Dorne would remain independent of the Iron Throne until the reign of Daeron I, generations later, achieved a brief conquest. And true lasting union would only come generations after that, through marriage rather than conquest at all. A fact this documentary will return to only briefly, since it lies well beyond the scope of Aegon's own war. With the war effectively concluded outside Dorne, Aegon turned to the harder task of governing what he had conquered. He established a small council of advisors, appointed Orys Baratheon as his first hand of the king, and worked with the great houses he had either elevated or allowed to survive, Stark, Arryn, Lannister, Tyrell, Baratheon, and the River Lords, to build a functioning administrative structure across a continent that had never been governed as a single political unit before. Aegon's genius, such as it was, lay less in the conquest itself than in what came after, recognizing that continued rule by dragonfire and terror was not sustainable indefinitely, and that lasting legitimacy required incorporating the very houses he had defeated into a shared structure, rather than replacing them wholesale with Targaryen loyalists imported from Dragonstone. Nearly every great house that exists in the era of the later books
Stark, Arryn, Lannister, Tyrell, Baratheon, owes its continued position directly to decisions Aegon made in these first years. Who to spare, who to elevate, who to let keep their old titles under a new crown. This is worth dwelling on as a genuine act of political imagination, distinct from the military campaign that preceded it. A conqueror with 3 dragons and no further need to prove his power by force could plausibly have chosen almost any governing structure he wanted: direct rule through Targaryen-appointed stewards, garrison occupation of the old regional capitals, the systematic replacement of the old nobility with a new one drawn entirely from Dragonstone loyalists. Aegon did essentially none of this. Instead, he preserved regional government almost entirely intact. The North still governed from Winterfell by Starks, the Westerlands still governed from Casterly Rock by Lannisters, the Vale still governed from the Eyrie by Arryns, with a single, comparatively light layer of centralized authority added on top, a crown that could call on those regional powers for men, taxes, and loyalty, but that otherwise left the old machinery of local rule almost entirely undisturbed. The practical effect of this choice was to make the new order dramatically cheaper and more stable to maintain than the alternative. Garrisoning 6 conquered kingdoms with an occupying Targaryen administration would have required manpower Aegon's small invasion force never remotely possessed. The entire logic of the conquest, after all, had been substituting 3 dragons for a large standing army in the first place. Governing through the existing regional houses, their legitimacy now derived from the new crown rather than threatened by it, let Aegon rule an entire continent with a court, a small council, and a garrison at King's Landing, rather than an army of occupation spread across 7 kingdoms. It is, in retrospect, difficult to imagine any other structure that could have held. Let's spend a little more time on the actual machinery Aegon built, since the histories, understandably fixated on battles and dragons, tend to give this part of the story less attention than it deserves, even though it's arguably the part that determined whether the conquest would last a generation or a lifetime. Orys Baratheon, fresh from his victory at the last storm and his elevation to the Stormlands, served as Aegon's first hand of the king, the crown's chief officer, tasked with the practical work of administering a kingdom Aegon himself, by temperament, seems to have found less naturally engaging than the campaign that built it. Choosing a hand from among the war's own commanders, rather than an outside courtier or a Dragonstone loyalist with no independent standing, sent the same signal as the Baratheon and Tyrell elevations. The new regime's most trusted offices would be staffed by proven men who had earned their positions, not merely inherited or been appointed to them by fiat. The broader small council that grew up around Orys Baratheon in these early years is recorded, across the histories, in less granular detail than we might like. A Grand Maester bridging the new crown to the Citadel's own institutional knowledge and record-keeping. Officers overseeing the beginnings of a royal treasury and the collection of the customs and levies that would fund the new government. And, in time, a master of ships beginning the work of a royal fleet, since Aegon's conquest had been won entirely by dragon and by land, leaving the crown with essentially no naval power of its own at a moment when several of its new subject kingdoms, the Iron Islands chief among them, possessed considerable fleets of their own that a wary new king would want the crown to eventually match or at least monitor. What's most notable about this early council, reading between the lines the histories provide, is how quickly a war fought with 3 dragons and a few thousand soldiers gave way to a government run by ledgers, correspondence, and the unglamorous daily business of tax collection and dispute arbitration between lords who, only recently, had been independent kings. This transition, as much as any single battle, is where the conquest actually succeeded or failed as a long-term project, and the fact that the government Aegon built in these years was still recognizably functioning 3 centuries later through the reigns of dozens of his descendants is itself a form of evidence for how well the initial design held up. Aegon ordered the Iron Throne forged from the swords of his defeated enemies, melted down by Balerion's fire, according to tradition, a process said to have taken months. The resulting throne was deliberately uncomfortable, full of blades and sharp edges. A design tradition holds was intentional. A king should never sit easily. The symbolism here is about as direct as medieval-style political theater gets. A throne built from 1,000 conquered swords was a permanent physical reminder to every lord who visited the new capital of exactly how the new dynasty had come to power and exactly what continued defiance would cost.
There is a second layer to the throne's design worth noting, beyond pure intimidation. A seat deliberately built to be uncomfortable, to cut and prick whoever sat upon it if they grew careless, reads as a piece of political messaging aimed as much at future Targaryen kings as at visiting lords. Tradition holds this was intentional on Aegon's part. No king should ever sit that throne entirely at ease. Whether this reflects Aegon's own genuine political philosophy or later embellishment by chroniclers looking to draw a moral from the throne's shape is impossible to fully verify. But the throne's continued use, essentially unaltered by every Targaryen monarch for the next 3 centuries, suggests the symbolism was taken seriously by the dynasty itself, not merely imposed on it by outside storytellers after the fact. The war camp Aegon had built on Landing grew, in the years following the conquest, into King's Landing, chosen as the new capital both for its symbolic status as the site of the original landing and for its strategic position on Blackwater Bay, within reach of Dragonstone and central to the newly unified kingdom's river and sea trade routes. Within a generation, it had grown from a wooden fort into one of the largest cities in Westeros.
It's worth pausing on how unusual this choice of capital actually was, in the context of everything covered so far in this documentary. Every other major city in Westeros, Old Town, Lannisport, White Harbor, Gulltown, had grown up over centuries around some pre-existing center of trade, faith, or lordship. King's Landing had none of that history. It existed, at the moment of the conquest's end, only because Aegon had happened to make camp there 2 years earlier. That a city of this scale and permanence could be willed into being, essentially from nothing, within a single generation, is itself a demonstration of the same concentrated royal authority the rest of the conquest had just established. The crown could command the labor, resources, and population needed to build a capital city from bare hillside in a way no single great house acting alone ever could have. Conquest in this story is mostly told through battles and burnings, but a continent does not stay unified because of a memory of dragonfire alone. It stays unified because someone works out in the years immediately afterward how to pay for the peace. And this is a part of the story the more cinematic retellings tend to skip past.
Aegon's government required revenue to function at all. A small council, a standing presence at King's Landing, the beginnings of a royal fleet, and a modest standing force, none of which paid for itself. The new crown's income rested on customs duties collected at the great port cities, on taxation arrangements negotiated with the great houses rather than imposed by direct royal collectors reaching into every village, and on the simple fact that a unified realm reduced the overhead every regional lord had previously spent on border defense against neighboring kingdoms, resources that could, at least in principle, now be redirected rather than spent refighting the same old regional wars. This is worth naming as another, quieter form of the same bargain struck with Torrhen Stark and Loren Lannister. The great houses were not merely allowed to keep their lands, they were, in effect, offered a new economic arrangement in which the costs of a fragmented Westeros, standing armies maintained against neighboring kingdoms, tolls and disputes at every regional border, the periodic devastation of actual inter-kingdom war,
were traded for a single, comparatively modest tribute to a central crown. For a great house that had just watched what happened to Harrenhal and Mern Gardner, that trade likely looked considerably more attractive than it might have a decade earlier.
The deeper point is this. A conquest sustained only by the threat of dragonfire is a conquest that ends the moment the dragons are gone. And Aegon, whatever his motives, seems to have understood that from very early on. The economic integration of the Seven Kingdoms, shared trade routes, a single currency standard eventually taking hold across regions that had previously used their own varied coinages, reduced friction at what had been hostile borders, gave the great houses a practical, ongoing reason to prefer the new arrangement to the old one, independent of any dragon at all. It is this economic integration, as much as any lingering fear, that explains why the realm Aegon built held together for centuries after Balerion himself had died of old age. Aegon's marriages to both of his sisters reflected the Valyrian dragon lord tradition of marrying within the family, a practice the Targaryens maintained long after most Valyrian customs had otherwise faded, and one the histories present without imposing later moral judgment as a matter of in-world cultural context rather than scandal, at least within Targaryen circles, though it was viewed with some discomfort by the wider Andal-descended nobility of Westeros, whose own traditions did not share this custom.
It's worth explaining briefly why the Targaryens preserved this Valyrian custom when it had largely faded even among the old freehold's other former Dragonlord families by the time of the Doom. The practice traces to Valyrian beliefs about keeping the bloodline, and implicitly the ability to bond with and ride dragons, concentrated within the family rather than diluted through marriage into outside houses. Whether dragon riding ability is genuinely hereditary in any strict sense, or whether Valyrian and later Targaryen traditions simply believed it to be so, is not a question the histories resolve definitively, but the belief itself was clearly powerful enough to sustain a marriage practice most of Westeros found genuinely strange across the entire span of Targaryen rule. Politically, the practice of marrying both sisters also meant Aegon entered his reign without any need to negotiate a marriage alliance with an outside great house, a decision that, however unusual to Westerosi eyes, denied any single kingdom the elevated status that would have come from providing the new king's queen. Neither the Starks, nor the Lannisters, nor any other house could claim to be uniquely bound to the new dynasty by marriage, because the new dynasty had, in effect, already married itself.
Aegon fathered children with both sister wives, Aenys with Rhaenys and Maegor with Visenya. This dual line of succession, two half-siblings, each the son of a different queen, each with a legitimate claim, planted the seed of a succession dispute that would not fully erupt until after Aegon's own death, but whose roots are visible from the moment both boys were born. It's worth naming plainly what made this arrangement more combustible than an ordinary succession by a single wife might have been. In most Westerosi successions, a clear order of birth among children of a single mother, however contested by ambitious younger sons in practice, at least offered an uncontroversial starting point for who came first. Here, Aegon had two sons by two different queens, each queen possessing her own independent political base, her own dragon, and, in Visenya's case particularly, a reputation for ruthlessness that gave her every reason to see her own son's claim advanced over her sister wife's. Whether Aegon himself ever settled, in his own mind, a clear preference between Aenys and Maegor before his death is not something the surviving record establishes with confidence, and that very ambiguity, left unresolved at the moment it mattered most, is arguably as responsible for what followed as any specific action either queen took. Aenys, Rhaenys' son, is remembered as a gentler, more indecisive ruler than his father, while Maegor, Visenya's son, is remembered as harsher and more martially inclined, closer in temperament to his mother than to Aegon. The contrast between the two half-brothers, and between the queens who raised them,
made a peaceful, uncontested succession unlikely from very early on. A problem Aegon's own conquest, for all its success, never fully solved, and one that would erupt into open conflict shortly after his death, in the brief but violent struggle that brought Maegor to the Iron Throne over the children of his half-brother Aenys. It is worth stating the broader lesson plainly, since it closes the loop on everything this documentary has covered about Aegon's approach to conquest and governance. Aegon solved, with real skill, the problem of incorporating 6 defeated kingdoms into a durable political structure, a problem that could easily have unraveled the entire conquest within a generation if handled badly, and didn't. He appears never to have solved, or perhaps never to have fully confronted, the much smaller and more intimate problem sitting inside his own household. 2 sons, 2 queens, and no unambiguous answer to which boy would inherit the throne their father, their aunts, and their family's dragons had built. The conquest secured Westeros. It did not secure the Targaryen succession, and that gap would nearly undo, within a single generation, what 3 dragons and 2 years of war had built. We return briefly to the question of prophecy, because it deserves its own honest treatment rather than a passing mention. Targaryen tradition held a belief, traced back to Daenerys the Dreamer, in prophetic dreams within the family, and Fire and Blood records that Aegon's invasion was preceded by dreams, reportedly Rhaenys, interpreted as a warning tied to some future threat. It's worth going back further to understand why this tradition carried any weight with the family at all by Aegon's time. Daenerys the Dreamer's original vision, generations before the conquest, foretold the doom of Valyria, the destruction of the entire freehold, and with it, every other Dragonlord house in the known world. That vision proved correct, catastrophically and completely, and it is the entire reason House Targaryen survived to conquer Westeros at all. Aenar Targaryen believed his daughter and moved the family to Dragonstone roughly a century before the doom actually came. By the time of Aegon, then, Targaryen prophetic dreams were not an abstract family superstition to be taken or left as one liked. They were a tradition with exactly one prior data point, and that data point had saved the entire family from extinction. Whatever skepticism the wider Westerosi nobility, or even the Citadel's maesters might have held toward prophecy in general, it is easy to see why a Targaryen in Aegon's position might weigh a dream considerably more heavily than most. It remains speculation whether this refers to what later Targaryens and others would call the Song of Ice and Fire, and whether Aegon genuinely believed unifying Westeros was preparation for a war against something beyond the Wall. The theory carries real weight within the setting's own internal mythology, popularized further by statements attributed to later Targaryens, but it is not something Fire and Blood itself confirms as Aegon's actual stated motive. The maesters who compiled the history treated it skeptically, preferring the more grounded political explanations covered earlier in this documentary. It's worth tracing, carefully and without overclaiming, how this idea was picked up by later generations of the dynasty, since the through line matters for understanding why the theory has the cultural weight it does within the story's own internal history. Generations after Aegon, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen is recorded, in accounts that remain themselves several steps removed from first-hand certainty, as having become convinced that a great prophesied hero, tied to a song of ice and fire, would be born of his line, and as having shaped major decisions in his own life around that belief. Later still, Daenerys Targaryen's own journey is bound up with prophecy in ways that echo the same family tradition stretching back to Daenys the Dreamer. None of this retroactively proves what Aegon himself believed at the time of the conquest. Later Targaryens interpreting a family tradition through the lens of their own convictions is a different thing entirely from establishing what the original conqueror actually intended 200 years earlier. but it does explain why the prophecy theory persists as a serious strand of in-world interpretation rather than a fringe idea. It fits a pattern of Targaryen belief that recurs across the dynasty's entire history, beginning with the one dream that is verifiably historically confirmed to have come true.
The honest documentary position. This remains one of the great open questions of Targaryen history, genuinely unresolved by the books, and it should be presented to the audience exactly that way. A fascinating possibility, not an established fact. What can be said with confidence is only this. Aegon's own generation had good reason, given their family's history, to take a dream seriously enough to act on it. What they believed the dream meant, and whether it had anything at all to do with the war beyond the wall that would eventually consume the dynasty's descendants, the surviving record simply does not tell us. Let's assemble the strategic picture in full. The dragon advantage. Air superiority no ground force could contest. Mobility that collapsed distances measured in weeks down to hours. A psychological weapon that could break an army's will before a single sword was drawn, as it did along Torrhen Stark's line at the Trident. And a siege-breaking capability that made the entire premise of castle warfare, proven at Harrenhal, obsolete.
Targaryen strategy. A repeated, deliberate pattern of offering surrendering houses continuity rather than annihilation. Loren Lannister kept Casterly Rock, Torrhen Stark kept the entire North intact, which made submission a rational choice for any lord doing the math after Harrenhal and the Field of Fire. Selective, spectacular destruction reserved for those who refused, which made the lesson unmistakable. And the elevation of loyal subordinate houses, Baratheon and Tyrell chief among them, to fill the vacuums left by extinguished dynasties. Westerosi weaknesses. Centuries of political fragmentation, meaning no unified command or shared strategic doctrine existed anywhere on the continent. Old rivalries, Reach against Rock, Stormlands against Dorne, that prevented any coordinated defense from forming before it was too late. And a military tradition built entirely around massed conventional warfare that had simply never had to reckon with an enemy that could win a war from the air.
It's worth stepping back and looking at the sheer economy of the whole operation once more, now that every piece has been laid out individually. In roughly 2 years, using a combined force that never numbered more than a few thousand conventional soldiers, 3 dragonriders dismantled 6 independent, centuries-old royal lines and replaced them with a single unified crown. A rate of continental political change that has no real precedent anywhere else in the setting's own history, before or since. Even the later Dance of the Dragons, fought with more dragons on both sides, never came close to reordering the map this completely, because it was a civil war within a single already unified realm, rather than the initial creation of that unification. The comparison is worth holding in mind for exactly this reason. The Conquest wasn't merely a big war. It was, structurally, one of the fastest and most complete redrawings of a continent's politics achievable by any means available in this world, dragons included. Across every kingdom examined in this documentary, a consistent pattern holds. Houses that submitted, Stark, Lannister, Arryn, kept their lands, their titles, and their bloodlines intact under the new crown. Houses that resisted to the point of total defeat, Hoare, Gardner, were extinguished entirely, their domains handed to new dynasties built from loyal subordinates. Dorne, uniquely, resisted without ever reaching that point of total defeat at all, because its style of warfare denied Aegon the decisive battle he needed to force the choice. Survival of the ruling house, in nearly every case examined here, proved more valuable than the battle itself. A lesson Torrhen Stark, whatever the North's later ambivalence about his choice, seems to have understood as clearly as anyone in the entire war.
It's worth stating the comparison as starkly as the histories themselves invite. Torrhen Stark and Mern 9 Gardner each commanded one of the largest hosts gathered during the entire conquest. One knelt without a battle and kept his kingdom whole for his descendants. The other fought and lost everything. His life, his army, and his family's rule of the Reach in a single afternoon. Neither man could have known with total certainty, before the fact, exactly how his own choice would end. But by the time Torrhen made his decision at the Trident, Mern's fate was already known. And it is difficult to read the Field of Fire as anything other than the single most persuasive argument Torrhen had available to him. Every factor that made the rest of Westeros vulnerable was, in Dorne, either absent or inverted. Its geography offered no single decisive target. Its political culture, shaped by generations of Rhoynar-influenced tradition distinct from the rest of Andal Westeros, did not organize resistance around a single crowned army whose destruction would end the war. Its style of warfare, honed against the Stormlands for a generation, was built around exactly the kind of dispersed, mobile, ambush-based combat that neutralized the dragon's greatest strength, a big, visible target to burn. And when the opportunity arose, Dornish engineers demonstrated with a single scorpion bolt that even a dragon was not invulnerable. A lesson that would echo, centuries later, in Aegon II's own War of Dragons, the Dance, where scorpions and dragon-slaying weapons proved decisive again and again. Dorne did not defeat Aegon, but it survived him, unconquered, for nearly 200 years afterward. The one kingdom on the map that proved the equation of 3 dragons equals total conquest had a limit. It's worth closing this analysis with the single clearest way to state Dorne's lesson for the whole conquest. Dragons won wars by destroying what an enemy chose to put in front of them. Every other kingdom in this story eventually put something in front of Aegon. An army at the Field of Fire, a castle at Harrenhal, a mustered host at the Trident. Because that was how Westerosi kings had always fought wars. And because a kingdom of any real size struggled to function, defend its borders, or even feed itself without eventually concentrating its strength somewhere. Dorne, alone, found a way to fight an existential war without ever fully doing that. It is the exception that reveals the rule everywhere else in this documentary. It was never really 3 dragons against 7 kingdoms. It was 3 dragons against 6 kingdoms that fought the only way they knew how, and one that refused to. This documentary would be dishonest if it ended on triumph alone. Harrenhal and his household died in Harrenhal's flames. An entire army, likely tens of thousands of men, died at the Field of Fire, along with the ruling dynasty of the Reach. Untold Dornish villages were burned in a war that dragged on for years without ever producing the clean, decisive ending seen everywhere else in the conquest. Rhaenys and Meraxes died in that same war. And beneath every one of the peaceful submissions, Torrens, the Vales, lies the coercive fact that they were choices made under direct, credible threat of the same fire that had already consumed a king and his castle. It's worth pausing on the men who are not named anywhere in this documentary, because the histories themselves rarely name them either. The tens of thousands who died at the Field of Fire were overwhelmingly common levies, farmers and small folk called up by their lords, most of whom had no say whatsoever in Mern the Ninth Gardener's decision to give battle, and whose deaths are recorded, when they are recorded at all, only as an aggregate number, rather than as individuals. The same is true of the Riverlander laborers worked to build Harrenhal over 4 decades under Harren's rule, and of the unnamed Dornish villagers whose homes were burned in retaliatory raids across years of inconclusive war. A documentary built entirely around 3 dragonriders and a handful of named kings risks, without meaning to, repeating the same omission the original chroniclers made, treating the war's actual human cost as a footnote to its royal drama. It is worth naming plainly, even without being able to name the people themselves. The overwhelming majority of those who died in this war were not the figures this script has spent the most time on.
Was Westeros unified, or was it conquered? The honest answer is both, and the two are not actually in tension. Unification here was not consent freely given. It was consent extracted by the believable threat and repeated demonstration of overwhelming destructive force. That doesn't make the outcome, a single, more stable political structure replacing centuries of intermittent inter-kingdom war, worthless. But it does mean the unification of Westeros rested from its very first day on a foundation of fire and coercion that the histories themselves never fully hide, however celebratory later Targaryen-sponsored accounts of the Conquest sometimes became. It is also worth weighing what the Conquest ended alongside what it cost. The centuries preceding Aegon's arrival were not themselves peaceful. The Stormlands and Dorne had been grinding each other down in intermittent war for a generation before Aegon ever landed. The Riverlands had known nothing but conquest and reconquest for longer than anyone could reliably remember. Border wars between the Reach and the Rock, between the Vale and its neighbors, recur throughout the pre-conquest history covered in Part 1 of this documentary. A single crown, whatever its origins, did substantially reduce the frequency of kingdom-against-kingdom warfare in the centuries that followed. The Seven Kingdoms would fight civil wars and rebellions after Aegon, but rarely again the kind of routine inter-kingdom warfare that had defined the centuries before him. Whether that reduction in one kind of violence justified the violence of the conquest itself is not a question this documentary can answer for you. It is, at minimum, the honest trade the histories present. Aegon's conquest produced a single ruling dynasty over 6 of the 7 future kingdoms, Dorne excluded until much later, a new capital at King's Landing, a small council system of governance, the Iron Throne as the enduring symbol of that rule, and a set of great houses, Stark, Arryn, Lannister, Tyrell, Baratheon, whose positions in every subsequent generation of Westerosi history trace directly back to decisions made in these first 2 years. It also produced something less celebrated, but just as consequential, a precedent. Aegon had shown that Targaryen dragons could decide the fate of the entire continent, and that succession within House Targaryen itself, given 2 sons of 2 different queens, was an unresolved fault line waiting to reopen. Both of these facts would recur across the next 2 centuries of Targaryen history, culminating, generations later, in the war that very nearly destroyed the dynasty that Aegon's conquest had built, the Dance of the Dragons, fought not against Westeros, but within House Targaryen itself, using the very dragons that had made the conquest possible in the first place. Before we close, it's worth taking a single final pass across the map. Not the map as it stood before Aegon landed, but the map as it stood at the end of his reign, house by house, to see plainly what the conquest actually rearranged. House Stark, the North, preserved whole under the same house, ruling from the same seat, its territory unreduced, the only kingdom to emerge from the conquest essentially unchanged in every respect except its formal independence. Torrhen Stark's choice at the Trident purchased exactly what it appears to have been meant to purchase. House Arryn, the Vale, preserved under Shara Arryn's line, the Eyrie unconquered in the most literal sense. No army ever took it, then or since. Its submission achieved through negotiation rather than battle. House Lannister, the Westerlands, preserved under Loren Lannister despite defeat at the Field of Fire, Casterly Rock's gold and the family's continued rule intact. The clearest illustration in the entire conquest that surrender after defeat, rather than defeat itself, determined a house's fate. House Hoare, the Iron Islands and the Riverlands,
extinguished entirely at Harrenhal. The Iron Islands would go on to select new leadership independent of the mainland riverlands, which reverted to local riverlord governance under the new crown, rather than remaining a single Ironborn-ruled domain. House Gardener, the Reach. Extinguished at the Field of Fire, its centuries of rule ended in a single afternoon. House Tyrell, formerly stewards at Highgarden, rose to fill the vacancy, the clearest example of the Conquest creating an entirely new great house from what had been a subordinate family.
House Durrandon, the Stormlands. Extinguished with Argilac's death at the last storm, though its blood arguably continued through Argella Durrandon's marriage into the new House Baratheon, founded by Orys Baratheon in the old Durrandon seat of Storm's End. House Martell, Dorne. Alone among the great houses covered in this documentary, still fully independent, still ruling from Sunspear, still outside the Iron Throne's authority, a status that would persist for nearly 2 centuries after Aegon's death, until Dorne's eventual union with the realm came not through conquest at all, but through marriage, generations later. Taken together, this final accounting is the clearest possible summary of everything this documentary has argued. Submission preserved, defiance to the point of defeat extinguished, and exactly one kingdom, the one whose geography and warfare denied Aegon the single decisive battle every other war had turned on, remained standing entirely outside the new order altogether. 6 kingdoms became one. The 7th would wait 200 years. He began with one dynasty, 3 dragons, a small army, and a divided continent that had never known a single crown in all its recorded history. He ended with a throne forged from 1,000 swords, a capital grown from a war camp, a political order that would outlast him, his children, and his children's children. But the central irony of Aegon's conquest is one the history itself never lets you forget. He built a kingdom with dragons, and the very dynasty those dragons made possible would, generations later, very nearly destroy itself with the same weapon. Brother against sister, dragon against dragon, in a civil war that would leave House Targaryen with almost none of the fire that had won it Westeros in the first place. That war, the reign of Aenys, the reign of Maegor, and eventually the Dance of the Dragons, is a story for another documentary. This one ends where it should, with a conqueror, sitting on a throne built from the swords of everyone who had once believed Westeros could never be ruled by a single crown. He was wrong to believe that. Aegon Targaryen proved it.